The girl waved to the royal guard every day. 3 years later, something amazing happened. The morning fog clung to London streets like a thin veil, transforming the imposing silhouette of Buckingham Palace into something almost ethereal. Amelia Matthews hurried along the familiar path, her leather messenger bag bouncing against her hip as she navigated through the early morning crowd. At 25, she had mastered the art of the London rush hour, weaving between tourists and commuters with the practiced ease of a long-time resident. That morning had started like any other, with Amelia running slightly late to her job at the publishing house. Her dark curls were still damp from the shower, and she clutched a travel mug of coffee like it was her lifeline. But something felt different about this particular morning. Maybe it was the way the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden strips across the palace gates. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being another face in the crowd. As she approached the section of the palace where a royal guard stood at attention, Amelia did something she'd never done before. Something that would unknowingly change the course of her next 3 years. She waved. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a small lift of her hand, accompanied by a slight smile. The guard, Officer James Carter, though she didn't know his name then, remained motionless. His red uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if she didn't exist. Amelia felt a flutter of embarrassment, her cheeks warming. What had she expected? These guards were famous for their stoicism, their ability to remain unmoved by tourists' constant attempts to make them smile or react. Yet something about his stillness, the absolute control it must take to remain so composed, fascinated her. The next morning, instead of hurrying past with her head down like everyone else, she did it again. This time, her wave was more deliberate, more confident. Again, Officer Carter remained still as a statue, but Amelia found herself studying his face. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his early 30s. There was something noble about his profile, like a figure carved from marble. Days turned into weeks, and her morning wave became as much a part of her routine as her coffee and rushed breakfast. Sometimes she wondered what possessed her to continue this one-sided interaction. Was it defiance against the unspoken rule that everyone should ignore these guards? Was it the small thrill of rebellion against London's culture of polite indifference? Or perhaps, she thought one rainy morning as she waved through the drizzle, it was because she understood what it felt like to be invisible in a city of millions. Her friends thought she was crazy when she told them about it. "You wave to a royal guard every day?" her best friend Lucy had asked over drinks one evening, laughing incredulously. "Like those guys with the big furry hats who never move? He's human under all that ceremony." Amelia had defended, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to. Besides, what if no one ever acknowledged him as a person? What if everyone just treated him like a tourist attraction? Lucy had given her a knowing look. "Only you would worry about the emotional well-being of a royal guard, Mel." But it was more than that. In a city where everything was constantly changing, where people moved in and out of her life like scenes from a fast-forwarded film, this small daily ritual gave her something constant to hold onto. The guard became her anchor in the chaos of London life, even though he never responded, never changed, never gave any indication that her presence meant anything at all. Some mornings, she'd catch snippets of tourists trying to provoke a reaction from him. They'd make faces, strike poses, wave their hands in front of his face. Amelia would feel a surge of protectiveness, wanting to tell them that he wasn't there for their entertainment. Her wave was different. It wasn't asking for anything. It was simply an acknowledgement, one person saying to another, "I see you." As autumn crept into winter, Amelia started noticing small details about Officer Carter. The way his chest rose and fell with carefully measured breaths. How his posture, though always perfect, seemed slightly more relaxed in the early morning hours before the tourists arrived. The barely perceptible shift of his weight from one foot to the other during his long hours of standing. She began to imagine a life behind the uniform. Did he have a family? What did he do when he wasn't standing guard? What made a person choose this life of rigid discipline and silence? One particularly cold morning, as she approached with her usual wave, something unprecedented happened. For just a fraction of a second, his eyes moved. They shifted ever so slightly to meet hers, and in that brief moment, Amelia felt her heart skip a beat. It was nothing, a microscopic break in protocol that anyone else would have missed. But to her, it was like witnessing a shooting star. That evening, as she sat in her small flat reviewing manuscripts, she found herself unable to focus. That tiny movement kept playing in her mind. Had she imagined it? Was she reading too much into nothing? But deep down, she knew what she'd seen. And somehow, it changed everything. Her morning wave was no longer just a quirky habit or a one-sided ritual. It had become something else, a secret shared between two people who had never spoken a word to each other. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Amelia realized that in this vast, impersonal city, she'd found an unexpected connection in the most unlikely of places. And though Officer Carter would never break his stance, never wave back, never speak, she knew that tomorrow morning, she would wave again. Because sometimes the most meaningful conversations don't require words at all. Life in London continued its relentless pace around Amelia. She earned a promotion at the publishing house, moved to a slightly better flat in Notting Hill, and went through 2 relationships that fizzled out like sparklers in the rain. But through all these changes, her morning ritual remained constant. February brought the worst snowstorm London had seen in decades. The city ground to a halt, with the underground running limited service and buses struggling on the icy roads. Most people worked from home, but Amelia bundled up and made the trek to Palace anyway. The usually crowded streets were eerily empty, the snow muffling the city's usual cacophony. As she approached Officer Carter's post, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, she noticed something different about him. His uniform was dusted with white, creating an almost ethereal effect against the red fabric. Despite the bitter cold, he maintained his stance, though she could see his nose and cheeks had turned pink from the freezing temperature. That morning, her wave felt more intimate somehow, as if they were the only 2 people left in London. Spring arrived, bringing with it a new awareness. Amelia began noticing things about Officer Carter that she'd missed before. The way his fingers would sometimes flex ever so slightly when the morning breeze picked up. How his breathing pattern changed subtly when pigeons landed too close to his post. The barely perceptible tightening of his jaw when particularly obnoxious tourists tried to provoke him. One sweltering July morning, she witnessed something that made her heart clench. A young mother with 2 children walked past, and the smaller child, a boy of perhaps 3, tripped and fell right in front of Officer Carter. While the mother rushed to help, Amelia saw it, a millisecond of concern flickering across the guard's face before his features reset to their usual stoic expression. That moment revealed something profound to her. Beneath the ceremonial uniform and rigid discipline was a man who felt everything but showed nothing. Her own life wasn't standing still. Lucy got engaged, and Amelia threw herself into helping plan the wedding. She dated a charming architect named Marcus who seemed perfect on paper, successful, kind, with a dry wit that made her laugh. But when he complained about her morning route being inefficient, and suggested she take a different way to work, something in her recoiled. They broke up 2 weeks later. "You're being ridiculous," Lucy said over emergency breakup ice cream. "You can't keep organizing your life around waving to a stranger who never waves back." "It's not about him waving back," Amelia tried to explain, but how could she describe this wordless connection she'd formed? How could she explain that this daily moment of acknowledging another person's humanity had become sacred to her? The seasons turned again, and Amelia noticed she'd started dressing differently for her morning walks. Nothing dramatic, just taking more care with her appearance, wearing the blue scarf that brought out her eyes, making sure her hair was properly styled instead of hastily pulled back. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October, the air crisp with autumn's bite. Amelia was running later than usual, having overslept after staying up to finish a promising manuscript. As she hurried along her usual route, she noticed something different about Officer Carter's posture. There was a subtle tension in his shoulders she'd never seen before. She raised her hand in her usual wave, and that's when it happened. His eyes met hers directly for the first time in all these months. Not a fleeting glance, but a deliberate look that lasted for 3 full seconds. In those seconds, she saw recognition, acknowledgement, and something else she couldn't quite name. The connection was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. All these months, she'd convinced herself that her waves meant something to him, but now she had proof. In that brief moment of eye contact, years of silence seemed to speak volumes. That evening, she couldn't focus on anything. The manuscript she was supposed to review lay untouched on her desk as she replayed the moment over and over in her mind. What had changed? Why today? She found herself researching the rules and protocols royal guards must follow, learning about their strict training and the severe consequences for breaking character while on duty. The weight of what had happened began to sink in. Officer Carter had risked reprimand, possibly even disciplinary action, just to look at her. The realization made her feel both elated and terrified. Their silent ritual had evolved into something more significant, more dangerous. The next morning, she approached his post with trepidation, unsure what to expect. Officer Carter stood as he always did, ramrod straight, eyes forward. But as she passed, she noticed his lips pressed together slightly, as if holding back words. It was then that Amelia realized their wordless exchanges had developed their own language, a language of micro-expressions, subtle shifts, and careful observations. Each tiny movement carried meaning, each controlled breath told a story. They were like two people who had learned to communicate through a wall, using taps and shadows to convey what words could not. As autumn deepened into winter once more, Amelia found herself wondering about the future. How long could this continue? What were they building with these daily moments of connection? She had no answers, but she knew one thing with certainty. In this strange, silent relationship, she'd found something rare and precious, a connection that transcended conventional communication, a relationship built on pure recognition of another person's humanity. What she didn't know was that their carefully constructed world of subtle gestures and unspoken understanding was about to be shattered in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, its implications hitting Amelia like a thunderbolt. The prestigious Frankfurt publishing house was offering her a position as their senior acquisitions editor, a dream role that would advance her career by years. The catch? She needed to relocate to Germany within 3 weeks. Amelia sat in her office, staring at her computer screen until the words blurred. The opportunity was incredible: better pay, more responsibility, a chance to work with international authors. It was everything she'd worked for since graduating. So why did the thought of accepting fill her with such profound sadness? "You're not seriously considering turning this down?" Lucy's voice crackled through her phone later that evening. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime, Mel." Amelia paced her flat, phone pressed to her ear. I know. It's just, there are things here I'm not ready to leave behind." There was a long pause before Lucy spoke again, her voice gentler. "Is this about him? The guard? You make it sound crazy when you say it like that." "Because it is a little crazy, honey. You've never even spoken to him. You don't even know his name." But that wasn't true, Amelia thought. She knew him in ways that transcended words. She knew how his posture changed minutely when he was fighting fatigue. She knew the exact shade of brown his eyes turned when the morning sun hit them. She knew the nearly imperceptible way his chin lifted when he approved of something, a gesture so subtle she'd spent months convinced she was imagining it. The next morning, Amelia found herself walking slower than usual along her familiar route. Everything looked different now, knowing these might be her last few days here. The early morning light seemed more golden, the palace more majestic, the city's sounds more musical. Or maybe she was just finally paying attention to things she'd taken for granted. As she approached Officer Carter's post, her heart began to race. Should she tell him somehow? Leave a note? The idea seemed absurd, breaking their unspoken protocol after all this time. Besides, what would she say? "Thanks for letting me wave at you for 3 years." The weekend passed in a blur of preparations. Amelia signed her contract with Frankfurt Publishing House, began the process of subletting her flat, and sorted through 3 years' worth of accumulated belongings. Each task felt like cutting another thread that tied her to London. Monday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Amelia stood in front of her mirror, taking extra care with her appearance. This would be her second-to-last walk past the palace. Tomorrow would be goodbye. But as she approached Officer Carter's post, something felt different. The air seemed charged with an unfamiliar tension. Her usual weight felt heavy, weighted with all the words she couldn't say. For the first time in 3 years, she felt uncertain about their ritual. That evening, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, thinking about all the mornings that had led to this moment. How many times had she walked past that spot? Over 1,000, she calculated. More than 1,000 waves, each one a thread in this tapestry of silent connection they'd woven. Tuesday dawned gray and misty, a properly British goodbye, Amelia thought wryly. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. The blue dress she'd worn the first time she'd caught his eyes moving to meet hers, and the silver necklace her grandmother had given her for luck. The walk to the palace felt like walking through a dream. Every step seemed to echo with memories. The snowy morning when they'd been the only ones brave enough to venture out, the spring day when she'd seen him fight a smile at a passing dog's antics, the summer afternoon when she noticed him shifting his weight to ease his stance during a heat wave. As she approached his post for the last time, Amelia's throat tightened. She raised her hand, the gesture feeling simultaneously natural and strange. But halfway through the motion, she froze. Officer Carter's hand had moved. It wasn't imagination. His right hand, usually locked in its rigid position, twitched upward in an aborted salute. The movement was tiny, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years studying every minute detail of his stance. But to Amelia, it might as well have been a shout. Time seemed to stop. In that frozen moment, their eyes met, and Amelia saw something in his gaze that stole her breath: recognition, regret, and something that looked remarkably like goodbye. Then, as quickly as it had happened, his hand returned to its proper position. His face resumed its mask of indifference. But something had irrevocably changed. Amelia walked away on shaking legs, her mind racing. In 3 years, he had never broken protocol so obviously. The significance of that small gesture overwhelmed her. He had risked censure, perhaps even disciplinary action, just to acknowledge their final meeting. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, packing the last of her belongings and preparing for her early morning flight to Frankfurt. But her mind kept returning to that moment, to that almost salute that had said more than words ever could. That night, as she lay in her nearly empty flat, surrounded by packed boxes and echoing silence, Amelia realized something that made her heart ache. She would never know what might have been. The story of the girl who waved to the royal guard would remain unfinished, a tale of almost connections and nearly moments. Or so she thought. Because what Amelia didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her last wave hadn't been the end of their story at all. It was merely the end of its first chapter. That almost salute haunted Amelia through her first sleepless night in Frankfurt. As dawn broke over the unfamiliar German skyline, she found herself opening her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Something about that final gesture felt too deliberate, too meaningful to ignore. She began with a simple Google search. Royal Guard Buckingham Palace Protocols. Hours slipped by as she dove deeper into the world she'd observed but never truly understood. The rules were even stricter than she'd imagined. Guards could be severely disciplined for the slightest break in protocol. Even something as minor as a finger twitch could result in formal reprimands. This revelation made Officer Carter's almost salute even more significant. He hadn't just bent the rules, he'd risked his position for that tiny acknowledgement. During her lunch break, Amelia found herself scrolling through various social media platforms, searching for any mention of the Royal Guards. She joined several forums dedicated to London's royal traditions, hoping to glean some insight into the mysterious figures who stood watch over the palace. It was on one such forum that she first saw his name. A recent post showed a photo of several guards in their off-duty uniforms, celebrating what appeared to be a retirement party. The caption mentioned, "Officer James Carter," in passing, and Amelia's heart skipped a beat when she recognized his distinctive profile, even without the ceremonial bearskin hat. She messaged the person who'd posted the photo, creating a careful story about being a journalist researching an article about the Royal Guards. The response came back quickly. "Oh, James Carter? He's quite well known among the guards. Been there nearly 15 years. Word is he's retiring next week, bit early, but apparently got some special dispensation." Retiring? The news hit Amelia like a physical blow. She checked the date mentioned in the post. It would be just 5 days after her departure. The timing seemed impossible, almost cruel in its irony. Unable to contain her curiosity, she reached out to an old university friend who now worked in the Ministry of Defense. "Hey Sarah, any chance you could tell me about the retirement protocols for Royal Guards?" Sarah's response was intriguing. "Funny you should ask. There's been some buzz about a high-profile retirement coming up. Apparently, this particular guard is leaving for medical reasons, something about an old injury flaring up. It's all very hush-hush, but the higher-ups are making an exception to the usual retirement age requirements." Medical reasons? Amelia's mind raced back through her countless observations. Had she ever noticed him favoring one leg? Was there any sign of discomfort in his stance? She thought she noticed everything about him, but now she wondered what else she might have missed. Through another contact, a cousin who worked in palace administration, she learned more pieces of the puzzle. Officer James Carter had served with distinction in the military before joining the Queen's Guard. He'd been wounded in action but had refused a medical discharge, instead requesting a transfer to ceremonial duties. "He's a bit of a legend, actually," her cousin wrote. "Never had a single disciplinary mark in his record. Perfect attendance, perfect performance reviews. The younger guards all look up to him. Perfect record." Until that almost salute to her. The more Amelia discovered about Officer Carter, the more questions she had. Why had he chosen to acknowledge her on his last week of service? Had he known all along that both their times at the palace were coming to an end? She found herself creating a digital folder labeled JC Research, filling it with every scrap of information she could find. A passing mention in a newspaper article about palace ceremonies. A blurry photo in the background of a tourist's Instagram post. A brief quote in a military newsletter from years ago. "The duty is not about standing still. It's about standing for something greater than yourself." Late one night, unable to sleep in her temporary Frankfurt apartment, Amelia stumbled across something that made her sit up straight. A local London Gazette article from 15 years ago featured a young James Carter receiving a commendation for an act of bravery. While off duty, he noticed a pattern in tourist behavior that led to the prevention of a potential security threat at the palace. The article quoted his commanding officer. "Carter has an exceptional ability to observe and analyze his surroundings while maintaining absolute professional composure." Amelia stared at those words for a long time. All those times she thought he was just a statue, he'd been watching, observing, protecting. Their daily interaction hadn't been one-sided at all. He'd been equally aware of her, perhaps even from that very first wave. A new notification popped up on her screen. Someone had responded to her inquiry on a military forum. The message was brief but startling. "Carter's retirement ceremony is invitation only. Very unusual for a guard of his rank. Word is he specifically requested it that way." As Amelia sat back in her chair, processing this information, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was anonymous. The subject line simply read, "For the girl who waved." Her hand trembled as she opened it, and the contents made her breath catch in her throat. It was an invitation, not to a public ceremony, but to a private retirement gathering for Officer James Carter, to be held in a small venue near the palace. At the bottom of the invitation was a handwritten note. "Some stories deserve a proper ending." Amelia stared at her computer screen, her heart pounding. After 3 years of silence, after countless waves and subtle glances, after an almost salute that had seemed like goodbye, was this finally their chance for a real hello? The Frankfurt airport was chaos at 4 a.m., but Amelia barely noticed. She'd booked the earliest possible flight back to London, running on nothing but adrenaline and 3 shots of espresso. Her new boss had been surprisingly understanding when she requested an emergency personal day, perhaps seeing something in her expression that brooked no argument. Just one day, Amelia had promised. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Now, as the plane touched down at Heathrow, the reality of what she was about to do hit her. After 3 years of silence, after countless waves and unspoken exchanges, she was going to witness Officer James Carter's final moments as a royal guard. The morning was unusually bright for London, the sky a pristine blue that seemed to mirror the significance of the day. Amelia had chosen her outfit with deliberate care, a deep navy dress that reminded her of the guard's winter uniform, paired with the silver necklace she'd worn on what she thought would be their last encounter. As she approached Palace, the familiar path felt different. Tourists were already gathering, their cameras ready, completely unaware that they were about to witness the end of an era. Amelia checked her watch, 8:45 a.m. According to the schedule she'd found, this would be Officer Carter's final shift change. She positioned herself in her usual spot, her heart thundering against her ribs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, and the ceremonial changing of the guard was about to begin. This time, however, it would be different. This would be James Carter's final march. The ceremony started with its usual precision. The new guards approached in their immaculate formation, their synchronized steps echoing against the palace walls. Amelia held her breath as she watched Officer Carter, standing at his post for the last time. Even now, in his final moments of service, his posture was perfect, his dedication unwavering. Then something unexpected happened. As the replacement guard approached, Amelia noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. The usual tourists were still there, taking photos and pointing, but mixed among them were several men in civilian clothes who stood with military bearing, former guards, she realized, come to witness their colleagues' final moments of service. The replacement procedure began with its usual ceremonial precision. But as Officer Carter prepared to hand over his post, Amelia saw something that brought tears to her eyes. The replacement guard, just for a moment, executed his salute with an extra flourish, a tiny deviation from protocol that spoke volumes about the respect Carter had earned. This was her moment. As Officer Carter took his final steps away from his post, Amelia raised her hand in what would be her final wave. Time seemed to slow down, the morning air crystallizing around them. Then it happened. Before turning for his final march, Officer James Carter executed a perfect, regulation salute. It lasted precisely 3 seconds, exactly by the book, but it was unmistakably directed at her. In that moment, every unspoken word, every silent exchange, every subtle glance over the past 3 years seemed to culminate in this one gesture. The tourists around her continued snapping photos, oblivious to the significance of what they'd just witnessed. But Amelia saw the reactions of the former guards in the crowd, the slight nods, the knowing looks. They understood what it meant for a royal guard to break protocol in his final moments of service. As Officer Carter marched away for the last time, his steps as measured and precise as ever, Amelia felt tears rolling down her cheeks. A woman next to her offered a tissue, misunderstanding the reason for her emotion. "The changing of the guard always gets me too, dear," she said kindly. But this wasn't just any changing of the guard. This was the end of something profound, something that had begun with a simple wave and evolved into a connection that defied explanation. After the ceremony, Amelia remained in place, watching as the crowd dispersed. The new guard stood at attention, but the spot would never be quite the same. She noticed some of the former guards who'd attended lingering as well, speaking in hushed tones. One of them caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod of acknowledgement. She overheard fragments of their conversations. "Never broke protocol in 15 years. Most dedicated guard I've ever served with. Going to miss the old boy." As the morning wore on, Amelia finally turned to leave, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. That's when she noticed an elderly man in a palace uniform watching her. He approached slowly, his eyes kind. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "The one who waved every morning?" Amelia nodded, unable to speak. The man smiled. "In 30 years of working at the palace, I've never seen anything quite like it. He never said a word about you, of course, not his way. But we all knew. The way he stood a little straighter at exactly 8:50 every morning, the way his eyes would track back to his post on his days off. He pressed something into her hand, a small envelope. This came with strict instructions. To be delivered to the girl who waved after the final ceremony. Amelia stared at the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. The man touched her shoulder gently. The retirement gathering is tonight, you know. At the Victoria Arms. 8 o'clock. He gave her a meaningful look. The back room. As she walked away from the palace for what she thought would be the last time, Amelia held the envelope close to her heart, still unopened. Some words needed the right moment, and this letter, whatever it contained, deserved its proper time. The sun was high in the sky now, casting a golden glow over the palace grounds. In a few hours she would finally meet the man behind the uniform, hear his voice, learn his story. But for now, she held on to this moment, the perfect ending to their silent ritual, sealed with a salute that broke protocol but kept faith with something far more important than rules. The Victoria Arms was a small, traditional pub tucked away from London's busy streets. At precisely 7:55 p.m., Amelia stood outside its weathered wooden door, the unopened letter still in her purse. She'd spent the afternoon in a daze, alternating between nervous anticipation and disbelief at how much had changed in a single day. She'd finally read the letter an hour ago, sitting in her old favorite coffee shop. The handwriting was precise and measured, just as she would have expected. For 3 years, you showed me that humanity exists even in silence. Tonight, I hope to thank you properly. J.C. The back room of the pub was warm and inviting, lit by vintage brass lamps that cast a gentle glow over the gathered crowd. As Amelia entered, conversations hushed briefly. She recognized some faces from the morning ceremony, but her eyes were drawn to a man standing by the fireplace. Without the bearskin hat and ceremonial uniform, James Carter looked both familiar and strange. He wore a well-fitted navy suit, his posture still military straight but somehow more relaxed. When he turned and saw her, a smile transformed his face, not the slight twitch she'd spent years trying to detect, but a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. "You came," he said, his voice deeper and softer than she'd imagined. "I wasn't entirely sure you would." "How could I not?" Amelia replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Though I still don't know how you managed to get that invitation to me in Frankfurt." His eyes twinkled. "I had 3 years to learn about you, remember? Including which publishing house had been trying to recruit you. The rest was just careful timing." A waiter appeared with 2 glasses of champagne, and James led her to a quiet corner of the room. Up close, she could see the laugh lines around his eyes that his stoic guard expression had always hidden. "I have a confession to make," he said, setting down his glass. "I noticed you before you ever waved at me." Amelia's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "You used to walk past every morning, always looking down at a book or manuscript. Then one day, you looked up and really saw me. Really saw us, not just as tourist attractions, but as people. That first wave, it wasn't just a gesture. It was recognition. Is that why you let me keep doing it?" He laughed softly. "Let you? From that first morning, your wave became the highlight of my day. Do you know how rare it is in my line of work to be seen as human? Tourists treat us like statues. Even most Londoners look right through us. But you saw me. I always wondered if I was bothering you." Amelia admitted. "If you wished I would stop." "Quite the opposite." James took a sip of champagne. "Your daily wave gave me something I hadn't even realized I was missing, a connection to the world outside the uniform. On difficult days when the weather was brutal or my leg was acting up, I'd find myself thinking, just make it to 8:50. "Your leg?" Amelia asked, remembering what she'd learned about his medical retirement. James nodded, patting his right knee. "Old war wound. Never properly healed. I could have taken a medical discharge years ago, but I wasn't ready. The guard duty was my way of continuing to serve, even if I couldn't be in the field. But lately..." He shrugged. Time catches up with everyone. What will you do now? I've accepted a position training new guards. Less standing, more teaching. And... He hesitated, then continued with a slight smile. It's based in Frankfurt. Amelia's eyes widened. Frankfurt? But that's... a complete coincidence. He finished. Or perhaps not. The position was offered months ago, but I only accepted last week, after I heard about your new job. Sometimes the universe has a way of keeping stories going. As the evening progressed, they traded stories, Amelia sharing her interpretations of his subtle movements over the years, James revealing which ones had been intentional and which she'd imagined. They laughed about the tourists who'd tried to make him break character, and he told her about the times he'd nearly slipped up. The hardest day, he confessed, was when you wore that blue dress and nearly tripped on the curb. Every instinct told me to reach out and catch you. Breaking position would have been worth it. Other guests stopped by their corner, sharing stories and congratulations, but the world seemed to revolve around their conversation. Former colleagues of James revealed that they'd had a running bet about when he would finally break protocol to acknowledge her. The day you miss your usual time because of a tube strike, one former guard told Amelia. He shifted his weight every 30 seconds. For us, that's practically pacing. As the evening drew to a close, James walked Amelia out. The London night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. When do you start in Frankfurt? She asked. 2 weeks. I have some loose ends to tie up here first. He turned to face her. Would you be interested in getting coffee before then? No uniforms, no protocols, no silence. Just two people getting to know each other properly. Amelia smiled. I think we already know each other better than most. But yes, I'd like that very much. As they parted ways, Amelia felt a profound sense of rightness. Their story hadn't ended with that final salute. It was just beginning again, transforming from a silent connection into something new and full of possibility. 3 years of waves had led to this moment. And now, in a different city, they would have the chance to write a new chapter, one where words were allowed, where smiles didn't have to be hidden, and where timing was finally on their side. Sometimes the best stories begin with a simple wave. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they don't end with goodbye.